first event at the center, and we're very honored and happy to welcome Christophe Crombez, who's a political economist who specializes in European Union politics and business government relations in Europe. His research focuses on EU institutions and their impact on policies, EU institutional reform, party politics, and parliamentary government. Christophe Crombez is a senior research scholar at the Europe Center at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies at Stanford University since 1999. He teaches Introduction to European Studies and the Future of the EU in Stanford's International Relations program. Furthermore, he's a professor of political economy at KU Leuven in Belgium since 1994. His teaching responsibilities in Leuven include political business strategy and applied game theory. Christophe Crombez obtained a BA in applied economics from KU Leuven in 1989 and a PhD in business political economics from Stanford University in 1994. Please join me in welcoming Professor Crombez.
I'm very happy to be here in Los Angeles. I had hoped that the weather would be a bit nicer than in Northern California, but apparently that is not the case. But nonetheless, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to talk about Brexit today. I know a lot is being said about Brexit these days. You can spend your entire day or even week reading up on newspaper articles and policy analyses related to Brexit. What I will try to do today is maybe take a little bit of a step back away from the day-to-day mass hysteria, sometimes on Twitter and other social media venues, and discuss Brexit from, I would say, a little bit a step removed from day-to-day events. Nonetheless, it's maybe not a bad week to give the talk this week. 2 days ago, Theresa May, Prime Minister May, gave a speech on Brexit for the first time. She was rather specific compared to what she'd been doing the past 6 months on what she envisages as the future relationship between the EU and the UK and the future place of the UK in the world. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk a little bit about the vote itself. Okay, it's already 7 months ago almost, but I'll talk a little bit about what it was all about, what the arguments were that were made, and how the results can be interpreted. Then I'll talk a little bit about the choices the UK has to make, and what Prime Minister May's speeches tell us about these choices, and then I will try to look ahead toward the future relationship between the UK and the EU, and what the vote implies for both of them. First of all, maybe I should say that, as was mentioned in the introduction, that I grew up in Belgium, and even though I will try to be as objective as possible today, that experience of growing up in Belgium probably colors my opinions a little bit. I grew up maybe a 15-minute ride from EU headquarters. And I think in general it is very difficult to find many Eurosceptic Belgians. So I sort of come to this talk with, in general at least, a positive attitude toward the EU. Now, that being said, I'll try to be as objective as possible. Now, first let's look at the election campaign, the referendum last June that led to this Brexit. And I would first like to look at the arguments that were made by both camps, and starting out with the camp of the leavers, the people who wanted to leave the EU. And at that time, if you had visited their website, you would find 3 reasons why the 3 main reasons clearly mentioned for leaving the EU. And those are the ones I will quickly go through now. The first reason, the first thing they were complaining about was the huge contributions of the United Kingdom to the European Union budget. And Theresa May actually also mentioned those contributions in her speech 2 days ago. Now, if we look at the contributions, then it's true that they were not negligible. 5 billion euros per year, about 0.23% of gross national income of the United Kingdom. So, okay, 5 billion euros, it's not negligible, but I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about the budget contributions that the UK made to the EU, that the EU budget is very small. The EU budget is only 1% of EU GDP. So even countries that are net contributors like the UK, they don't contribute all that much relative to their GDP. And in fact, if you look at the contributions, the UK was by no means the largest contributor as a function of its national income. It was, out of the 28 member states, the 10th largest contributor. The Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden contributed significantly more, were the top 3 contributors. The Netherlands almost 3 times as much as the UK as a percentage of its GDP. Germany and Sweden more than double what the UK contributes. By the way, I also mentioned here on this slide who the highest net recipients are of the EU budget. And I want to point out one country in this list, Hungary, gets more than 5% of its gross national income annually from the European Union. That will be important when we talk about other countries and what they will do, whether other countries may leave as well. You may know that Hungary is one of the countries led by a government that is most anti-EU. In spite of the rhetoric, if you look at the 5% contribution of the EU to the Hungarian GDP, I would be very doubtful that even the current Hungarian government would have any plans to leave the EU, unless it wanted to say goodbye to 5% contributions. The second point being made was that not only did the UK contribute, or does it contribute a lot to the EU budget, the UK is also often outvoted in EU institutions, and since it is part of the EU, has to then, even though it didn't agree with certain policies, has to implement those policies and make those policies into their own policies, transform its own national laws. So it lost a lot of sovereignty to join the EU and to remain in the EU. But you could argue that this is part of the success of the EU, in fact. If the EU has been more successful than the United Nations or the WTO or whatever other institution, you could argue that it's precisely because countries can be outvoted and not just any country can veto just about any policy. Now, it does happen to be the case, if you look at the numbers, that the UK does get outvoted relatively often. If you look at, I don't know whether you can see this very far down the room, but the country in the past, well, not the past 7 years, but between 2009 and 2015, the country that was outvoted the most in the Council was the United Kingdom. So out of the 600, the UK voted in favor 616 times and against and abstained 86 times. So even if you add up its no votes and its abstentions, you would say, well, that sort of amounts to about 12% or so of the votes. But still 12% to be outvoted 12% of the time and having to implement 12% of whatever the rules that are being passed, even though you didn't like them, you could say that's a high percentage. It's more than twice as much as Germany and Austria, and the Netherlands, and so on, Poland, the countries that were outvoted the most, other than the UK. If you look, though, at what happened before 2009, in the previous parliament, the 2004-09 European Parliament term, the UK was not all that much of an outlier. Of course, 2004-09, most of that period, in fact, that entire period, was under a Labour government. So you could say that this, to some extent, the fact that the UK was outvoted a lot was a byproduct of the fact that there was a conservative government or a conservative-led government in the United Kingdom. The third main argument, immigration, and as we will see, probably the one that resonated the most with voters and that determined the results. The third argument being made was that as being part of the EU, the UK could not sufficiently control immigration because of the free movement of people within the EU. As a result of the Treaty of Rome in 1957, all member states of the EU at that time, and the ones that later joined, agreed that its citizens would be able to move freely throughout the EU and look for jobs in other countries, reside there, get social benefits, and so on. Now, did immigration actually have a big impact on the UK and compared to other countries? Well, here I have a few figures. This is net immigration into the United Kingdom, starting in '75, shortly after the UK joined the EU, all the way to 2015. And what do we see? That this is 100,000 here, so this goes up to 400,000. That there was a clear increase in net immigration into the UK. You could say sort of gradual throughout time. You could say, well, yes, there are a lot of people immigrating. So people are right. There's a lot of immigrants into the UK, especially compared to what it was like many, many years ago. Now, if we then go and look and see, well, where do these immigrants come from? Well, let's first look at the EU, immigration from the EU, from other EU countries. I guess the most important line here is the one in the middle. That is the net inflow. The green line is how many people from other EU countries moved into the EU. The purple line here is the outflows from the UK toward the rest of the EU. And then this is the net inflow. What do we see? That the net inflow was pretty small up to about this year, 2004. Then there was a big jump to about a net inflow of 100,000 people, so 100,000 EU citizens moving into the UK every year. And then it went up again, a small dip in 2008, and then it started going up again in the past couple of years. Notice that here, this happened, this peak from close to zero, you could say, to 10,000, to about 100, happened in 2004. What happened in 2004? A whole bunch of Eastern European countries joined the European Union. This here, of course, is a financial crisis, the dip here, and then this increase coincides, you could argue, with a few other countries joining the EU, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia. Now, let's look further into that. Let's look into the question, well, okay, there's this inflow of EU citizens. Where do they actually come from? And this is the total, actually as a percentage of the total inflow. So we can see here that between '04, when more people from the EU started migrating towards the UK, from 2004 up to 2014, the share of immigrants from EU countries as a percentage of the total inflow into the UK rose from about a quarter to about 50%. So that's a first thing that you can observe. Even today, or in recent years, if you look at the migration into the UK, only half of these people come from the rest of the EU. And the EU doesn't say anything about what countries should do as far as their migration policies are concerned vis-à-vis third countries. So if people complain in the UK about immigration and blame the EU for it, the EU can, strictly speaking, only be blamed for half of it, because only half of the immigrants come from the rest of the EU. The EU doesn't tell Britain what it has to do vis-à-vis immigrants from, I don't know, the United States, for example. Now, so about half, and it used to be only a quarter. Where do the immigrants come from? The line that is most talked about would be the purple one. These are the immigrants from 8 Eastern European countries. The 8 Eastern European countries that joined in 2004. That's a total of 8 countries with about 80 million people, half of them, half of that population living in Poland. So if we look at immigration from those countries, we can see that that increased a lot, from 10 to almost 25% the first few years after they joined the EU, but not so much since then. After that, it went back to about 15%. The red line here, and the one that increased the most in recent years, that used to be about 15 and now is about 25%, the red line is immigrants from the other old 14 member states. So this is France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on. And then we have immigrants here from the 3 countries that joined recently. That has gone up a lot in the past few years. So if we look at immigration from the EU, and people in the UK complain about free movement, that seems to be the most important point now. Where do the immigrants from the EU come from? Well, there was a clear increase 10 years ago from immigrants that came from Eastern European countries that just joined the EU. Now, why did that happen? Of course, because these countries joined and then they could move freely. But very important there is to point out that at that time the UK had a very different attitude toward immigration. The UK was telling the rest of the world and Europe, we are an open, trade-oriented country. We are not narrow-minded like you guys on the continent. In fact, what happened was when the Eastern European countries joined the EU, just as had been the case before, the countries that were already in the EU, they had the right to observe a transitional period. Countries were concerned about having too many Eastern Europeans move toward Belgium, France, whatever, to find jobs. So in order to make that transition not too drastic, they had the right to, I believe for 7 years or so, to restrict immigration from Eastern European countries. One country that did not want to do that, or not at least not for the full 7-year period, was the United Kingdom, because they were open-minded about immigration, they needed labor, and their economy was doing well. So in a way, if there was an increase in immigrants from Eastern European countries 10 years ago in the UK, to some extent, that was a result of their own very liberal policies toward immigration at that time, policies that were more liberal than in other European countries. What about the increase in recent years? Okay, there is some increase from Bulgaria, Romania, and so on, not the largest countries to begin with. But the main increase in the previous years is from other old EU countries like France and Germany. These are not the people who take away a lot of the jobs in the manufacturing industry. These are people who are usually highly educated and go to the UK to work in the city, in the financial industry, or for consulting companies or so. So regarding immigration and the points that the UK made about immigration, you could argue, well, okay, there was an increase in immigration. Half of the immigrants do come from the EU, but sort of the picture that is being painted of the Polish plumber taking away the jobs of British workers and manufacturing workers and stuff like that is not really the correct picture. To some extent, there were a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe 10 years ago because the UK wanted that. But in recent years, they're mostly immigrants that flock to London because London has sort of become one of the most cosmopolitan international cities with a strong financial sector and so on. So it has attracted a lot of highly skilled, highly educated people from the continent. If I teach in Belgium and I talk to my students when they graduate, what are you guys going to do? I teach in an economics department. Every year there's quite a number of sometimes some of the smartest students in the economics who graduate with an economics degree who actually go and take a job in London. So those are the people that have immigrated recently, at least to a large extent. Anyway, I already started criticizing the arguments. Now I'll talk a little bit about the arguments that the Remainers made. First of all, their rebuttal to the arguments that were already made, that were made by the Leavers. The first point, which I did not point out yet, related to the contributions. I think that is actually the silliest argument that was made during that entire campaign. The net contributions to the EU budget, the 5 billion euros, is not really all that significant. If you ask people what is the EU about, the EU is about creating a large market and strengthening the European economy. As a result of that, the EU is not really involved in many programs that redistribute money. There is money spent on agriculture, regional aid to poorer areas, poorer countries and poorer areas in Europe. But as I already mentioned, the EU budget is very small. So the contributions of any country are very small relative to the advantages they receive from being part of that large market. And it's very difficult to find good estimates of the advantages to the UK economy of being in the EU market. I just mentioned one number here that I found somewhere, 150 billion. But even if it's only 50 billion, or even if it's only 10% of this estimate, that's still a lot larger than the contribution to the budget. The budget in the EU is relatively insignificant compared to all the rest that the EU does. The main project of the EU does not involve any transfer of money. Setting up one large market does not require budgetary transfers. Moreover, the second point, if the UK wants to leave the EU but still stay in the single market, be part of that large market, as some other countries are doing, other countries that never joined, but this is sort of the Norwegian model or the Swiss model. What does the EU do? Does the EU say, well, yes, you can be part of this large market? No, the EU says, yes, you can be part of it, but you have to live by the rules, and you also have to contribute to the budget. Not as much as if you are a member, but countries like Norway and Switzerland, they also contribute to a bunch of projects, programs that the EU runs. And if you listen to Theresa May's speech last Tuesday, she made it very clear that she does not want to be in the single market. But then she does add to that, well, yes, we will remain involved in some programs, and we will, of course, pay whatever is the right amount that we need to pay for that. So even in her speech there, she acknowledges this, that even when they leave, they would still contribute to the budget. Second point or rebuttal that Remainers made regarding sovereignty, you could say, well, yeah, that's right. It's hard to dispute that the UK gets outvoted relatively often, but that's what happens if you join an institution like the EU. And moreover, if the UK wants to be part of the single market, then it would still need to stick to the rules that the EU imposes. This is a situation that Norway finds itself in. Norway is part of the internal market, but it's not in the EU. What does it imply for Norway? Norway abides by the rules, but has no impact on setting the rules. That's even worse than being in it, most people would agree. So to the extent that the UK stays in parts of the internal market, as seems to be the way it is heading now, it will still need to stick to these rules. And even if the UK says, we don't want to have anything to do with that single market of yours, what will UK companies have to do if they want to export their products to the EU? Their products would have to satisfy EU rules. So again, UK businesses would have to live by rules set by the EU, without the UK being involved in it. So it's hard to see how leaving the EU from a sovereignty perspective is actually a step ahead. That the UK would actually gain sovereignty from leaving the EU. Could say, well, it will probably lose sovereignty. And somehow, if you, part of that argument about sovereignty, also if you read Theresa May's speech from 2 days ago, relates to the authority of the European Court of Justice. And the EU has a Court of Justice. And the current UK government doesn't want to have that courts play a role. They prefer British courts to decide on whether the UK stuck to the rules. It's kind of an interesting argument to make, very weird, I would think. To some extent, Theresa May is saying we don't mind living by some of the rules that you set, but we want our courts to decide whether we're actually doing it correctly. not so sure that anybody in the rest of the EU will go for that. But anyway. Third point regarding immigration. For the EU, the free movement is, as it has been made clear already, is part of the internal market, is an essential part of it. So it doesn't seem like the UK would get very far if it insisted on being in the single market without accepting free movement. But it seems to have, at least the current government seems to have realized that. You could even argue also, that's my last point here, that if the UK withdraws, that there may be actually more immigrants going to the UK. Because right now, for example, there are some agreements with France, and that France keeps out people who want to use the channel to get to the UK. If France were to withdraw from that agreement, you could argue there would be more immigrants. I have a few more slides on immigration, but I don't want to spend too much more time on that. What they basically show is that if you look at how the UK compares to the rest of the EU, the UK doesn't have all that many more immigrants or foreign-born nationals. It's about at the average, about 10% or so of Europeans are in each member state are foreign-born. That's about the same as in UK. There are some countries where it's way higher. This also shows that a majority of the people who are foreign-born in the UK were actually not born in the rest of the EU. They come from other countries. And one last slide, maybe regarding immigration. People talk a lot about the effect that the asylum crisis of 2016 and prior to that had on the vote, 2015 mostly. Well, this slide shows that there were actually not all that many asylum seekers or refugees that went to the UK. These are absolute numbers. The UK is about here. This is like 40,000 or so. Germany here has way more, and even a small country like Belgium has more asylum seekers than the UK. More arguments that the Remainers made, that the UK carries more weight in world politics as part of the EU than when it stands alone. That Europe should be united these days, and it'd be important that it be united, given the fact that there are authoritarian rulers to its east and to its south, and given the fact that there are terrorist threats and other factors of international uncertainty or potential instability that I will not specify, but that are clear. And of course, there's another point that that is also could also be problematic to the UK. That is that its unity itself may be threatened when it leaves. Scotland may decide to have another referendum. There could be problems in Ireland. In fact, the Northern Irish government collapsed a week or so ago, and there's going to be an election for a new Northern Irish parliament in early March. The fact that Britain voted for Brexit actually did contribute to that, at least in the opinion of most analysts. I won't say too much about the vote itself. It was not all that convincing a vote, you could say. 52% voted to leave. And if you look at who voted to leave, it's mainly rural England and Wales and small towns, whereas Scotland and London and college towns voted in favor. If you look at income, I bet you guys probably, I'm sure, heard most of this, there was a disproportionately high percentage of people with lower income, lower education, older people, men, and white people. Those had higher proportions of people voting in favor of leaving. So one thing you could say about, if you want to interpret this result, is that it was not so much about the economy. The results, the referendum results, cannot really be explained by how well Britain is doing economically, but maybe more to do with what my colleague Simon Hicks, he came up with these 3 I's. I stole this from him. He basically would say that this election was about 3 I's: identity, immigration, and inequality. Sounds very familiar to the US, I think, and explaining what happened in November. This also shows that basically that people who voted in favor of leaving, they were not very positive about concepts like multiculturalism, liberalism, feminism, green movement, globalization, the internet, and so on. I'm going to skip these three things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the steps ahead. Well, the UK needs to make a couple of decisions, and to some extent, it looks like it has made some of those, even though if you read the papers about what Theresa May said on Tuesday, the papers would make it seem like she was very strident and very anti-EU and is basically going for a hard Brexit, what is called a hard Brexit. It's not completely clear if you look at it very carefully. You could still interpret many things in many different ways. So to some extent, these questions are still relevant. One question, when to trigger Article 50. Article 50 is the article in the EU treaty that starts the process to leave the EU. Now, she decided she announced in October that the process would start in March. She will probably stick to that, if only because she would probably lose face if she didn't stick to it. But it's not really all that good in terms of timing, because you have elections coming up in France in April and May, then in Germany in September, and probably in Italy also in the next few months. So with elections in three of the most important countries in the EU, it's hard to imagine that much progress would be made in these conversations that would basically decide on what the relationship between the UK and the EU will be like. Now, Article 50, once that article is triggered, there's 2 years to find an agreement. And if there is no agreement, then that's it. The country that applied to leave is out of the EU. There are some legal discussions going on, I'm aware of that. But basically, that's what it seems like, that once the 2-year process is started and there's no agreement, the UK is left with nothing. So the day of starting this process is very important, because on that day, the UK has basically, when that process starts, the UK has a very weak bargaining position. And if you read Theresa May's speech, she basically came up with a whole list of requirements and what she wants. And then she said, I hope you guys are going to give this to me. If not, we are going to be trading with the rest of the world, and you guys will be missing out on all the opportunities you could have trading with us more closely. It looks a little bit, I don't know whether it's wishful thinking or it's a little bit funny in a way, to see a country and a small market of about 60 million people tell that to its neighbor that has almost 500 million people. This is Article 50. We cannot talk too much about this. Other decisions they have to make, and that seems they have made them to some extent, is whether to prefer to go for staying in the internal market or limiting immigration. Now it seems that the choice has been made to limit immigration. But if you read the text of all the speeches very carefully, in a way, what Britain wants is to a large extent remain in the internal market, but limit immigration as well. The policy that was officially phrased by the foreign minister, by the foreign secretary during the campaign, as eating the cake and having it too. That seems to be still somewhat the policy of the UK government. That would all lead to a hard Brexit, where they would not be in the internal market really, but try to trade freely, sign free trade agreements with the rest of the world and the EU as well. Now the problem there is that free trade agreements take a very long time to negotiate and to sign, to agree on. It takes many, many years. And the international climate these days, whether it be in the US or in Europe, is not specifically very favorable towards free trade. On top of that, the UK does not have any people who are used to negotiating free trade agreements, because the EU has been doing that for the UK for the past 40 or so years. So this would be a very difficult situation for the UK to find itself in. I'm going to skip this also. These are some of the statements that the Prime Minister made. I think I will skip those too. Looking ahead, what kind of scenarios are there? Well, I think one scenario that is still possible, in spite of the sometimes harsh rhetoric in speeches on both sides of the English Channel, it's possible that we go to a pretty amicable divorce. That there will be an agreement on Article 50 on some practical matters, like who's going to pay for the pensions of the British EU employees and stuff like that. And that they will say, well, okay, you guys can leave. We're not going to be able to work out all the details, as the Prime Minister agrees herself also, in the next 2 years. So we'll have some kind of transitional agreements. And you get to stay in the single market to a large extent. Some particular parts that you don't want to be in, you can stay out of, just like Switzerland did. And we will also require you to continue to make some budgetary contributions. And we allow you to have some restrictions on the free movement, which in a way the EU already allowed a little bit in an agreement they made last year. So that's still possible. Because if you sort of take a step back, you would say, well, the UK and the EU both have an interest to make this work. They trade a lot with one another. And some countries, specifically Belgium, the Netherlands, the countries closest to the UK, they trade a lot with the UK. And if the UK were to start having to pay tariffs to import its products into the EU and so on, that would hurt those economies as well. So there is still that possibility, I believe. However, it's also possible that we're going for a lot more of an acrimonious type of divorce, and that there will not be an agreement. In that case, the UK will just be out with no transitional agreement, and it will be up to the UK to negotiate free trade agreements with the EU and many other countries. Now, what would be the implications for the UK? As I already mentioned, UK unity could be threatened as a result. If we look at UK party politics, I don't know whether you looked at the most recent opinion poll in the UK, but the Conservative Party is doing great in the opinion polls. Why? Not because everybody is thrilled about Theresa May, but because the opposition is so weak. The Labour Party is in disarray. UKIP has sort of lost its reason to exist, because its main reason to exist was to oppose the EU. The Liberal Democrats, the one party that you could argue is really pro-EU, are stuck around 10% of the vote. So where is this heading to? Well, it looks very likely that if there were another election, that the Conservative government would increase its majority. So there's no change in policy coming from that side. What does look like most likely, though, is that as a result of all this, the UK will be consumed, though, with negotiations with the EU, negotiating free trade agreements, and it will be a diminished Britain, as pointed out in The Economist today. UK that turns more inward, unfortunately. I would also argue, I'll talk about the second point here, because I think I have to sort of round up. I think it's unlikely that other countries follow the UK's example. What we've seen is that in most Northern European countries that contribute to the EU budget, Scandinavia, the Netherlands and so on, that support for the EU has actually gone up since the vote in Britain. I think that other countries are going to be reluctant, voters in other countries are going to be reluctant in a period where there's at least increased policy uncertainty and potential for instability with the elections here in the United States, and with the elections in the UK, with the Brexit referendum, are going to be increasingly more unlikely to vote in the same way. I would expect, there's an election coming up in Germany, I would expect that Angela Merkel, in spite of her dip in popularity as a result of the refugee crisis, is going to win a big victory, because she will be looked at as one of the few elements of stability in world politics today. And she is in fact already up in the polls compared to where she was a few months ago. So I would not be surprised if she would turn out to be the big winner of elections in Germany. Then there are, of course, a few countries in Eastern Europe that, for different reasons, have taken a more negative attitude toward the EU recently, Hungary and Poland. But these countries tend to be recipients of EU money. So I don't really expect those countries to take very decisive steps towards leaving the EU either. And then we also should not forget about how this Brexit came about. Well, it was because the Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, decided to call a referendum. If he had not done that, we would not be where we are today. Now, he's not the only person, though, not the only Prime Minister in Europe who made mistakes and who unwillingly brought about events that he did not intend. The Italian Prime Minister also called a referendum, well, he had to, in December, and also lost. So I think it's highly unlikely that another European leader will call a referendum on the EU or another important topic, because chances are very high that things won't turn out too well for the person who does so. As far as the EU is concerned, what can the EU do? What are the implications for the EU? Well, people talk a lot about the need for EU reform, about the institutions not working very well. Well, I've studied the EU institutions for the past 20 years or so, and maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I don't think their performance is all that bad. Now, what people talk a lot about is taking power back to London or to Budapest or to wherever. Well, if that means giving countries a veto right, I think that would be a very bad thing to do, because what happens when you give countries a veto right, then there's not really any policy that is being set of any significance. So that would be the best recipe for countries to, for the EU basically to become completely irrelevant, to give member states veto rights and so on. What they could do is give national parliaments a bigger role in EU politics. But that, to a large extent, is a responsibility of member states. There are some countries, like Scandinavian countries, where the national parliaments are very much involved in what the national member state governments do in Europe. And as a result of that, they feel less unhappy about what the EU is doing. The problem with the UK and some other countries is, though, Belgium, for example, but Belgium is not so much anti-EU, but the problem with the UK specifically was that it doesn't like the EU very much, and at the same time, its national parliament hardly plays a role in how its government sets EU policy. So if there is a problem related to the democratic functioning of the EU, I would argue that to a large extent that problem is at the level of the member states. Each member state, its political system can make sure that policies that are set at the EU are basically more supported by its political system itself. So I don't think the problem is too much with the institutions. One thing that the EU should, I think, do is to set policies in areas that speak more to its voters, to its people. The EU is dealing a lot with setting policies in areas where nobody really seems to care too much about. It sets rules on the composition of different chemicals and how many chemicals are allowed in that product and in that product. That's not really what voters care about. Unfortunately, though, a lot of policies that opinion polls show a lot of European voters would want to be dealt with at the European level, like foreign policy, counterterrorism, and so on. In a lot of those areas, insufficient steps are being taken and more could be done. But that requires countries giving up their veto rights. So what is going to happen for the EU? Of course, I don't know. I'm relatively optimistic. Often in the EU, crises lead to further integration and more effective policies. You could argue that the refugee crisis, for example, has led to and is leading to closer cooperation. What the EU will have to do in the end is basically police its borders together, at least the Schengen area, and they're on their way of doing that with lower numbers of immigrants, of refugees as a result. But it could also, of course, be that the different member states are going to continue to argue about all kinds of things related to Brexit, for example, that will be focused on Brexit, and that in the end, I don't think it will further unravel, but it could. There is a potential, I think, that the EU would become, in the next few years, less effective and less important as a result. I think I would want to leave it at that, so that there's enough time for questions.